So in this video I'm going to talk you through types of data. So there are 4 that you need to know. The first 2 are primary and secondary data. So primary data is when a psychologist, a researcher, collects the data themselves. So they go up to participants and they might ask them some questions. If it was a self-report, they might observe their behaviour and then write down their behaviour. They might do an experiment and get them to do something in either a controlled setting or a natural setting, and they would analyse that data. So they kind of know what they're searching for, what they're trying to find out about behaviour, and they go and collect the data and they analyse that, and then that gives us explanations for behaviour. Now, in some instances, there's already data available, so it's a bit of a waste of time and money to do your own study when you can get the data from somewhere else. So there's a lot of places where there might already be data that the researchers can use. So for example, there's lots of hospital records, criminal records collected by the police. The census has kind of like household information on things like ethnicity and everything about kind of characteristics of people is collected via that. If anyone's wrote a diary, for example, as psychologists we might be interested in what's the psychological impact of war, and Anne Frank's diary would be a really good one to analyse. So we could have a look at that and see the kind of symptoms that somebody might go through when they're experiencing the impacts of war, or any letters that have been written, because these things are all collected for a different purpose. So they're not collected for the purpose of a psychologist, but the data is already there, so a psychologist can come along and have a look at it. Whereas the actual research methods that a psychologist is doing, like an interview, a questionnaire, an observation, some brain scannings, and maybe a controlled lab experiment, all of these things would allow the psychologist to collect their own data. So this is a past paper question that has been asked before. So we've got which of the following is secondary data. Now obviously they might ask you which of the following is primary, so you need to know both. And as we can see here, the recordings of an interview. Now we're assuming that this is an interview in terms of a psychologist interview rather than like a police interview, because it doesn't say that. We're assuming that that is that primary research method. So that primary data. Readings from a brain scan, as mentioned before, if that's in a lab setting, that is going to be primary data. And then observation notes, doing an observation, watching what people do and writing it down, that's going to be primary. So the only one there that is secondary is an autobiography of a serial killer. So this is where a serial killer talks about their own life, and so it's not been done for the purposes of a study, they're just writing about it for their own self. But by looking at that autobiography, psychologists will be able to see what it's like to think like a serial killer. Maybe, for example, they might be a psychopath, they might not have emotional activation in their prefrontal cortex, for example, or their amygdala areas, and so maybe that could explain their behaviour, and that might be seen in their autobiography. So we wouldn't have to do all of the other methods, which take time and money. We could just do this to begin with, and if we did this first as well, it might give us an indication of how to do a study on these things. And this is an example question that they might ask you. So this is just a simple, straightforward, what's the difference between primary and secondary data? So you literally put the definition of primary, you connect it with a whereas, and then the definition of secondary. So this here would get you all of the marks. We've got primary data is where the researcher collects data first hand for the purposes of the study, whereas secondary data already exists and is being collected by someone else for another purpose. And these here are some evaluation points for primary and secondary data. So a strength of primary data is that you design it to fit the aims and hypothesis of the study. Now, the reason why this is a strength, so you need to go a little bit further if you were to write this in an exam answer, which I'll show you an example of in a minute, is that if it's being designed, it means that you don't have then to worry about the accuracy of the data, so whether it's valid or not, and any kind of ways that that might have been misinterpreted. So you don't have to worry so much about whether you can trust the data because you've done it yourself. Whereas, as we've mentioned, it's a very lengthy and expensive process to do primary data because you've got to go to a lot of time and effort to recruit your participants and conduct your studies, your research. And then the flip of that is that secondary saves a lot of time and money because you don't have to contact participants, you don't have any ethical issues, it's quite easy to conduct it. But the weakness of secondary is that what you've got might not actually fit what you're researching. And then the additional thing to that, which is actually what's on the mark schemes, is that it might be inaccurate what they've said. Like, they might have misinterpreted the data, there might be some researcher bias there. And so that means that we can't really trust what the findings show us because we haven't done the study ourselves. So if I show you some exam questions on these, which were on the assessment that we've recently done, because I just got all the ones that I could find. So this was a scenario about a psychologist investigating whether headgear influence risk-taking behaviour. So we've got 30 participants and they are basically being given a baseball cap, a cycle helmet, or no headgear to see if that will affect how they risk take on a computer game. And so these are kind of the findings here. And the question says, what's the strength of primary data in this study? So primary data, you're doing the study yourself, you can kind of trust that what you have found is probably going to be accurate. So let's have a look at the mark scheme. So you've got an example here. It says, one strength of collecting primary data is as the psychologist recorded the risk-taking behaviour himself, he can trust the data and know it has not been misinterpreted by someone else. So it's just a lot more valid than what it would be if it was secondary data, because you never know like whether they've done it correctly or whatever. Now, what you're getting the marks for here is for saying what the strength is and then having an elaborated response explaining how or why in this study. So the second mark, you've got to say why and put it in context. So by context, it means mentioning what the DV is, what's being measured. So in this case, it's risk taking. So that needs to be in your answer. And then the point about can't trust the data because it could be misinterpreted would get you that second mark. And we've got a little bit of the fact that he's collected it himself. So you've got to kind of put the definition of primary data in there as well in order to kind of get all of the marks for that. We've got an easier one that is just like, what is primary data? So this is just a simple, straightforward definition. So we've got data collected directly by the researcher, first-hand information gathered by the researcher themselves. So really nice and straightforward for that one. And that's all we've got on primary and secondary data. So the next two types of data that we need to know are quantitative and qualitative data. Probably be a little bit easier actually to understand these two. So most studies in psychology collect quantitative data because it's numerical. So we do a lot of like tests. We usually get a score from a test, so we usually get a number that tells us, or for example, if we were interested in how aggressive people were, we might count how many times girls were aggressive, count how many times boys were aggressive, and compare them, so we'd have a number. So there's a lot of studies that use quantitative data, whereas qualitative data is non-numerical, so not numbers. It's quite descriptive. It doesn't have to be words, it could also be pictures, so we usually just refer to it as descriptive. And it's quite in-depth, so it's lots of detail to it. So it gives us lots of insights into people's thoughts and beliefs and the reasons as to why they've answered the way that they have. We get a lot more kind of information about it. And these are some examples of questions that have been asked before. So we've got, Hannah wants to investigate if Facebook leads to depression due to being envious of friends doing well and having more status. She's decided to collect the number of friends on Facebook and predicts those with more friends will be depressed as they are more to be envious of. What type of data is she collecting? So we've got number of friends on Facebook, so numerical data, we've got quantitative, and then we've got she's doing it herself, so we've got primary data. Whereas the second one, Javier, is investigating whether age affects the type of crime you commit. He's decided to use official statistics, so these are statistics collected by the government, which you'll learn about in the crime topic. And it shows the number of crimes committed by different age groups. So what type of data is he collecting? So again, we've got number of crimes, so we've got a number which is quantitative, but this time he's using some statistics that have already been collected. So we've got secondary data for that one. And then again, we might get a distinguished question, which was similar to the primary and secondary one. So again, it's the definition of one of them, whereas sandwiched in the middle, and then the definition of the next one. So here we've got quantitative data is numericals such as scores on a test. So you want to kind of put a little bit of an example, just so it's really clear. Whereas qualitative data is rich, detailed descriptions about thoughts or behaviour that indicate reasons why. It's probably a bit too detailed, that you could probably cut that down a bit, but that's kind of like a perfect answer. And then let's have a look at a question. So we've got a researcher has conducted an independent measures design experiment. They take part in one condition of the IV to investigate whether chewing gum influences concentration. And she's recording how many changes are detected in a spot the difference puzzle by people chewing gum when completing the task compared to those who were not. So one group's chewing gum and one group's not chewing gum. So what type of data is being collected? And again, we need to look for what's being measured, so the DV. And in this one, it is how many changes are detected in the spot the difference puzzle. And because it's how many changes, that suggests that we've got quantitative data. So it's measuring concentration, and they're doing that by the how many changes. So we've got quantitative data. So how we would answer this is we've got to say what type of data it is, and then we've got to give an example. So the bits that I've highlighted are useful to put in the answer as context. So for example, we've got quantitative data as they measured concentration by counting how many changes were detected in a spot the difference puzzle. So you're naming the data for 1 mark and you're linking it to the question. So anytime it says in this study, we want to make sure that we're linking it to whatever the DV is, whatever's been measured. Another one, so we've got a researcher conducted a study using a participant observation. So they took part in the people that they were observing, so they probably got in the bus queue with them, and they're investigating the behaviour of the people waiting in the bus queue. And they're writing the form the descriptions of how they've behaved. So again, the type of data here, well, it's clearly given us an example, like a hint of what it is, because they've said descriptions, so it's qualitative data. So again, we get a mark for qualitative data, and then we get a mark for saying how they've done it. So we've got qualitative data because they're measuring the behaviour of people waiting in the bus queue by writing on the forms descriptions of how people behave. So really nice and straightforward for those ones. Now, some strengths and weaknesses of quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data is really, really easy to analyse and compare your participants because it's what we call objective. Now, the word objective means that it's quite factual, it doesn't require any interpretation. We're not going to have any researcher bias where the researcher might misinterpret it because it's pretty obvious it's a number. It's quite easy to compare two numbers against each other. So therefore, it's probably quite valid, and valid in psychology is the word for being correct, being accurate. However, quantitative data doesn't tell you the reasons why. So just because someone said on a rating scale that they're an 8 out of 10 for happiness, you don't know why they're happy. It could be nothing to do with what you're investigating in your study. So you might be investigating the impact of school on happiness, but actually the reason for why somebody might be happy might be nothing to do with school. And so therefore it's a bit difficult to tell the reasons for behaviour with quantitative data. And qualitative data is the opposite. So whilst quantitative data you don't know the reasons why, with qualitative you do. So we get rich, detailed, in-depth data, and it tells us the reasons for behaviour. So it tells us why they're behaving like that. And so it's probably more correct. Because like in my other example, when I was saying that if you're investigating school and happiness, and it might be because of something else, I wouldn't know that with quantitative data. I wouldn't know if I had any EVs like that, whereas I'm more likely to know if I've got EVs with the qualitative data because it's a little bit more detailed and I can see that in my data. Whereas a weakness for qualitative is if you've got lots of writing to analyse, it requires some interpretation, and that means that the researcher might be subjective. So subjective means, it's on the bottom here, your personal opinion might affect what you are reading about and what you're interpreting as a psychologist. So you might show researcher bias, which is when that personal opinion affects your interpretation of it. So it's not actually true what you've interpreted, it's not valid, but you think it is because you don't realise that you've kind of maybe misinterpreted it because you've been a little bit subjective, probably without realising that you're doing it. So an example of an evaluation question, so we go back to our scenario before of the chewing gum and the concentration. Whenever it says evaluate, we want like a strength or a weakness. So I'm going to do a strength here. So we've got as quantitative data is numerical, so you might want to put a little bit of the definition in. And it's objective, so that's my strength. it's easier to analyse and compare. And I'm going to give an example in this study. So the thing that you'd be comparing would be the people's concentration when they're chewing gum compared to when they're not chewing gum, and the amount of changes that they've spotted on that puzzle. And then I finished it off with, and therefore it's more likely to be valid. Whereas a weakness is that it doesn't allow you to go into the reasons as to for that behaviour, so it might make the results invalid. So for example, I've put here the number of changes spotted in the puzzle is affected by how tired the participant is rather than chewing gum. That's a potential extraneous variable that there could be that I wouldn't spot with quantitative data. Let's have a look at our qualitative data example, so the bus queue one. So again, with this one, a strength of qualitative is very, very descriptive, and we can find out the reasons, and we want to link it to the question, so why people are behaving the way they are in the bus queue, because we've got lots of data to analyse, we can find out those reasons why. Whereas a weakness is it's quite difficult to analyse. The researcher might interpret someone's behaviour at the bus queue as rude if they push in the queue, but actually they might just not have realised people were queuing, and that researcher has personally misinterpreted that person's behaviour because it's more qualitative than quantitative. It's not as easy as going, oh, there's 5 people in the queue. It's this is the behaviour that they've done and they've wrote it down in detail, so they might misinterpret when they're writing that down. And these are some more questions. So we've got Roberto wants to investigate student mental health. He decides to interview students to find out how they feel and why, what data. So he's doing this himself. So we've got primary data, and he is finding out about the reasons why. So that's qualitative data. And then number 2, what is the strength of how Robert collects the data? So because Robert is collecting qualitative data, that tells you the reasons why people behave that way. And oh, that's a weird question. Just put the answer. Oh, because it's one correct answer. I was getting confused. I thought it was 2. I was like, there's not 2 right answers there. And then the final one, a weakness of how Robert collects the data, so he's collecting qualitative data, is that it is more difficult to compare and analyse the responses because of that subjectivity that we've mentioned before. And so I hope that was helpful. In fact, what I might do actually is just show you some of those questions that we did in class for, let's just see if there's any secondary ones on here. No, I don't think there is on there, so let's put so these are the ones that we did in class. So I'll show how in this, so we had the one about learning purposes and distraction using a tablet, and we've got males and females, and how they collected quantitative data. This was one that really confused a lot of people because what's actually being counted in this scenario is how many males use it for learning purposes and then use it for distraction, and how many females do. But what I was seeing in a lot of people's answers is that they were saying the number of times they use the tablet. So that's not what's happened here. So we've got to kind of look at the IV, which is gender, males and females, look at the DV, what they're measuring, and then try and figure out from that what it is that they're kind of measuring. So it's a little bit of a tricky one, that one. And then we've got this one about mental health. So one weakness of using quantitative data. Well, we don't really find out the reasons why they're suffering or how much they're suffering. We don't find out a lot of kind of information about their mental health conditions because we've only got that quantitative data. So it doesn't give us any insight into the behaviour, which was what was discussed when we were going through them. Let's just have a look for the qualitative ones. So we've got this one. I've done that one already. Identify the qualitative data question. So in this one, well, how much did you like the service? Excellent or good is going to be just one or the other. So it's a very short answer. Would you use it again? Yes, no. So again, those 2 are going to be quantitative because they've not got much detail to them. So although they are words, we can code them as like 1 could be excellent, 2 could be good, or vice versa. Maybe have 2 as excellent, 1 as good. 1 could be yes, 1 could be no. We could quantify that and say how many people said yes, how many people said no, so we can get kind of a number. But this one about how do you feel about the service, that's going to require people to actually write in a lot of detail and kind of describe like how they were feeling about that service, so we get a lot more insight from that question. And then finally, this one was about the meaning of dreams. What's one strength of qualitative data? Well, it tells you the reasons why people may be dreaming. So it's got rich, detailed data, useful for analysing links. I mean, that you don't have to put that. You could just say, so we've got understanding the meaning of dreams. She needs to be able to go into depth. Dreams are a unique experience which can't be quantified. So you could have said anything like that, really. You could have used something like higher construct validity, which basically just means that it's got more accuracy because it's got more detail, it's greater depth, it's richer. We can find out the real reasons for why people are dreaming. So that's all of the data information that you need, all of the questions that have been up in the past. So I hope that was helpful for you.